On the 9th of March 1950, an innocent man was escorted to the gallows at HMP Pentonville, having recently been found guilty of a heinous crime. This man had been convicted of the murder of his own wife and child. Timothy Evans was adamant that he had nothing to do with the murders. In court, he had repeatedly accused another man, his neighbour John Christie, of taking the lives of his young family, though almost nobody took him for his word. John Christie was the prosecution's star witness and a recently retired police officer, after all. This incredible miscarriage of justice would allow Christie, who was indeed the real killer, to go on to commit a series of despicable murders and solidify his name as one of the most heinous killers in British history. Hello everybody, and welcome back to Case Closed. In today's serial killer video, we'll be taking a deep look into the life of one of Britain's least well-known serial killers, John Christie. We will be covering his entire life, including his childhood, career, crimes, time spent on the run and eventual execution. If you are easily offended, this is your last warning to close the video now. I also want to quickly thank my audience for helping me reach 3,000 subscribers. In my most recent video, I was thanking people for the 2,000 subscriber milestone, and we have already passed 3,000 by the next. The support is incredible and I'm extremely grateful. I can't wait to see how much further we can push this channel and grow this community. If you're not already part of our growing community and you do enjoy true crime content, then I highly recommend that you hit the subscribe button as well as the bell icon next to it. This will notify you every time I post a new true crime video. And don't worry, you won't receive any spam notifications from me. I know exactly how annoying that can be. I really hope you all stick around. Thank you, and now let's get back to the video. John Christie was born on the 8th of April 1899 in Northerham, a small village located in Yorkshire, a county in the north of England. If you are a regular viewer of this channel, you will have heard a lot of stories out of Yorkshire. For some reason, a lot of the most evil serial killers in the history of my country have come from small towns or cities in that county. A very strange coincidence, if you ask me. Very little is actually known about Christie's childhood, though I have pieced together what I can, and I will go into as much detail as it is possible for me to do. John was born into a large family, the second youngest out of 7 siblings. His father was a cold and distant man who never displayed much affection to his children. His mother and sisters would take turns in bullying and then coddling the young child, resulting in a warped opinion of women, as well as an unusual temperament that he would never grow out of. When he was 11 years old, Christie was invited to attend Halifax Secondary School, where he excelled at mathematics, being particularly gifted in the study of algebra. He was found to be far above average intelligence, scoring around 128 on an IQ test. He was a quiet boy who did not have many friends, and he would usually keep to himself. John's first experience with death would come a year later, on the 24th of March 1911, when his grandfather passed away at age 75 after a long illness. John never spoke much about his relationship with his grandparents, though he did go on record to talk about his hatred and fear of his grandfather in particular. I'm unable to find any kind of explanation as to why he hated the man, just that he feared him. I don't want to speculate reasons or come up with rumours as to why that may have been in this video. However, I do encourage you guys to discuss this in the comment section below. When the family discovered that the grandfather had died, his body was laid out on a resting table for mourning relatives to say their goodbyes. John would eventually enter the room and gaze upon the corpse, feeling overcome with relief, but also with power. The man he had hated and feared the most in the entire world was now a lifeless body in front of him. And I do want to reiterate that John never explained why he hated his grandfather. During his teenage years, John was initially somewhat successful with the other sex and began to experiment sexually with girls his age, though almost all of his early attempts would result in failure, and before long John's self-confidence had suffered irrevocable damage. Rumours began to spread amongst his peers, and it wasn't long before Christie became known as Reggie No Dick and Can't Do It Christie. This bullying would leave a lasting effect on the boy, which he would carry with him for the rest of his life. Even as an adult, Christie found himself unable to perform sexually with women, including his own wife, and almost always had to resort to using the services of local sex workers in order to reach climax. He would go on to graduate from school just after his 14th birthday, something that was actually normal for the time, on the 22nd of April 1913, before finding his first job as an assistant projectionist. A projectionist is the person who operates the projector at analog movie theatres or cinemas. Modern cinemas use digital projectors that are much less complex to operate. At the outbreak of World War I in 1914, a wave of British patriotism washed over the country, and countless young men and teenage boys decided to enlist in the army and fight the war in Europe. Christie was no different, and during the September of 1916, he took it upon himself to join them. On the 12th of April 1917, just after his 18th birthday, he was called to join the 52nd Nottinghamshire and Derbyshire Regiment to serve as an infantryman, where he would be deployed for the first time in April of the following year on the French battlefield. Only 1 month into his deployment, Christie would be badly injured during a mustard gas attack. Luckily for him, someone had noticed that he was still alive and pulled him out of the trenches before arranging transport to a nearby hospital. Christie would spend 5 long weeks resting there, though by the end of it, he had made a full recovery. Later in life, Christie would often embellish this story in an attempt to garner sympathy from those around him, claiming that he was blinded and that he had lost his ability to speak for 3.5 years following the attack, though many experts have disputed these claims. They argue that he would not have been released as fit for duty had he been a mute, and believe that John was displaying a psychological reaction rather than a physical one. Christie would go on to be diagnosed with HPD, histrionic personality disorder, a personality disorder that causes people to fake or greatly exaggerate illnesses or injuries in an attempt to garner sympathy or attention from their peers. Christie was eventually discharged from the army just 2 weeks before the first anniversary of the end of World War I, on October the 22nd, 1919. It was around this time that he would meet his future wife, Ethel Simpson, who was from Bradford. Check out my video on Peter Sutcliffe, the Yorkshire Ripper, to learn more about the city of Bradford, which happened to be a part of his hunting grounds. The couple fell in love at first sight, and they were soon married at Halifax's Register Office on the 10th of May 1920. That evening, John would be unable to consummate their union, a result of his lifelong impotence and an early sign that their marriage would not be a normal one. John would never be able to consistently perform with his wife and continued to solicit the services of sex workers. However, sometimes he did manage to reach climax, and early in the marriage, Ethel would become pregnant. Whatever hopes Ethel may have had for her child were eventually scattered when she suffered every pregnant woman's worst nightmare, a miscarriage. She would never fall pregnant again. John found his first civilian job since leaving the military in 1921 when he gained employment as a postman. He had only been working again for a little over a month before he began to steal a lot of postal orders. He was caught for this on 2 separate occasions and was sentenced to 3 months imprisonment on the 12th of April that year. This was the start of a 10-year petty crime spree where John would commit numerous offences such as fraud, threats of violence, and larceny. By 1924, Ethel had grown sick of her husband's constant impotence and stints in prison. She broke off the relationship, though never officially divorced John, and decided to move to Sheffield to be with her parents and siblings. John would spend the next 3 years in and out of prison before finding employment as a lorry driver in 1927. John then took a 2-year-long hiatus from committing crime, though when he committed his next crime, it would be his most heinous so far. During the May of 1929, Christie was living with a housemate, an older woman named Maud Cole. On the 13th day of that month, they had a small disagreement which soon began to escalate. Eventually, John saw red and grabbed a cricket bat that was resting against the wall nearby He swung it at Maud's head before fleeing. However, he was quickly caught. He was incarcerated for this crime, though I am unable to find any record of how long this stint lasted. Either way, Christie was a free man by October 1933, which is when he was caught stealing a car. He was sentenced to another 3 months imprisonment, and it was during this sentence that he finally decided to stop committing petty crimes and swore to live a legal lifestyle upon his eventual release in 1934. After this final prison stint, Christie and Ethel reconciled their failed marriage, and in 1937, the pair moved into the top floor flat of 10 Rillington Place in Notting Hill, which was at the time a very low-class area in London. They would later move into the ground floor flat of the same property in December 1938, and this is where the vast majority of our story today will take place. At the outbreak of World War II, in 1939, Christie would apply to join the War Reserve Police. Somehow, he was accepted despite his lengthy criminal record and multiple prison sentences. It was later revealed that the authorities had failed to do a background check on the man. If they had, there is no way Christie would have ever been given such a position of authority over the average person. He wasn't just a career criminal after all, he was also a violent one. Christie was assigned to the Harrow Road police station as a constable. During his time in the office, he came across a married woman named Gladys Jones, whose husband was away fighting in the war. Somehow, despite John's impotence, the pair started an affair. John's affair with Gladys would continue until mid-1943, when her husband finally returned home from the war to discover Christie in bed with his wife. He beat Christie within an inch of his life, though let him live, something rather unfortunate for many of the women who Christie would come into contact with in the very near future. The 24th of August 1943, Christie came across a 21-year-old Austrian woman named Ruth Fürst, who worked in a munitions factory. To supplement her income, Ruth was also involved in sex work on the side. She would often spend her free time soliciting clients in local cafes or parks. John encountered Ruth as she was doing exactly this at a cafe located in Ladbroke Grove. Unfortunately, he rather easily managed to convince the young woman to accompany him back to his home, and the two set off on what would become Ruth's final journey. Ethel was away in Sheffield on a visit with her family at the time, so John took the 21-year-old woman back to his home. After the sex was over, Christie retrieved a length of rope and began strangling the woman for no apparent reason at all. He claims to have been overcome with the sudden desire to end her life and gave in to this twisted impulse. After Ruth had passed away, John stowed her body under the floorboards of his living room. The next evening, however, he retrieved the body and buried it in the back garden instead. He decided to do this because he knew the body would eventually begin to smell and attract insects as it decomposed, and he didn't want Ethel to find the remains. Soon after John's first murder, around the end of 1943, he would resign from the police force before finding work as a clerk at a radio factory in Acton, which is part of West London. This is where he would go on to meet Muriel Eady, a colleague who would unfortunately become his second victim. Muriel had fallen ill with a case of bronchitis, and Christie used her illness as a way to manipulate her into returning with him back to 10 Rillington Place. He made up a story that he had learned a cure for the illness during his days serving in the First World War, and promised that he could ease the woman's ailment. On the 7th of October 1944, Muriel and Christie finished their shifts at the factory and walked back to Christie's flat together, where the supposed cure had already been prepared. John had mixed a small amount of Friar's balsam, a solution used to clean infected wounds, with a heavy dose of domestic gas. The gas was 15% carbon monoxide, and the Friar's balsam was used only to disguise the smell. This mixture was trapped within a glass jar that had a tube extended out of the lid, which Muriel was intended to inhale through. After the pair had arrived, they sat down for a chat and both drank a cup of tea. When the drinks were finished, Christie retrieved his jar and instructed Muriel to slowly inhale as much as she could and to hold it in for as long as possible. After only a few breaths, Muriel had fallen unconscious, which is when Christie took it upon himself to SA her. After he was done, he strangled her to death and buried her alongside Ruth in the garden. This second killing marks a sudden and dramatic shift in Christie's method of murder. Where his first victim was a sudden, impulsive attack, John had meticulously planned his second kill. Unlike the killing of Ruth, it was undeniable that Muriel's murder had been premeditated. I have heard, though I am unable to confirm, that John and Ethel Christie were actually close friends with Muriel and her husband. There are claims that the two couples had spent many evenings going on double dates, a long-standing con that John had devised in order to gain his victim's trust. Eventually, after winning her over, all he would have to do is wait for Ethel to visit her family and prepare his special mixture. It's an extremely sinister thought that someone you had spent so much time with and had considered a close friend was planning to end your life from the moment they had very first laid eyes on you. You'd be forgiven for expecting John's lust to kill to become almost insatiable after this sudden progression. Surprisingly, however, John would actually take a very long break from killing at this point. It would be over 4 whole years before the impotent strangler would take another life. It is unknown why he took this break. He could have been suppressing his urges, though I think that it is probably more likely that he just never came across an opportunity. Some new neighbours, a newlywed couple named Timothy and Beryl Evans, would move into the Christie's old flat on the top floor of 10 Rillington Place after learning that they are expecting their first child. Beryl would go on to give birth to a daughter named Geraldine right inside of that flat. Though their relationship was in its early stages, the couple was somewhat toxic and would fight regularly. They could often be heard having loud arguments about how Timothy would spend all the family's money on alcohol and that Beryl did a bad job of keeping the home clean. Tim was a Welshman who had moved to London, and it is nowadays widely accepted that he had suffered from some kind of learning disability. As a child, he also suffered a head injury at around the age of 8, which caused him to miss a few years of school in recovery, something that would only exacerbate his underdeveloped mental state. By the time Timothy had grown into an adult, his IQ was widely reported to have been below 70, far below the average for a British man at the time. Timothy struggled with finding employment and was only able to complete basic tasks. All these factors would leave him in a position where he was only ever able to find jobs that paid him a very low salary. Combining this with his drinking problems and having 3 mouths to feed left his family in a poor financial position. Eventually, Beryl found out that she was pregnant a second time and decided that her family was unable to afford another child, despite how much she may have wanted to have one. She planned to have an abortion, a medical procedure that was still illegal in Britain at that time. At first, Timothy was strongly against the idea. However, eventually, Beryl convinced him to agree. On the 30th of November 1949, Timothy Evans walked alone into a police station before making a shocking confession. In the interview room, Timothy sat down with 2 officers before admitting to the murders of his wife Beryl and their unborn child. He claimed to have attempted to perform an abortion on his wife using a medical concoction that he had created, and in the process had accidentally killed her. He said that he had then dumped her body in a sewer drain before arranging for someone to look after his daughter Geraldine. Finally, he fled back to his hometown in Wales. After hearing this horrific confession, the police sent officers to the sewer drain where Timothy had supposedly dumped the bodies in order to retrieve the victims' remains. When the officers arrived at the site, though, there were no signs of a body, and the drain was far too heavy to be lifted by a single man. Something about Timothy's confession was already not quite adding up. Police then began a second round of questioning, and by that point Timothy's story had changed. This time, he said that it was his downstairs neighbour, John Christie, who had offered to perform the abortion for the couple. One morning, Timothy had left Beryl with John and went to work. It was the day that the abortion was scheduled for. Timothy worked the full day and then came home in the evening to find John acting flustered. This was the moment that John informed him that his wife had passed away during the procedure and that he had hidden her body. John then convinced Timothy to run away for his own safety, since he had arranged for it to happen, and as previously mentioned, abortions were illegal at the time. Christie then promised to arrange for Geraldine, Timothy's first daughter, to be looked after, and told him to flee to his hometown. After a few weeks without hearing from his daughter, Timothy became suspicious and returned to London. He then confronted Christie, who refused to give Geraldine back or to tell him where she was. Using the location of Geraldine as leverage, John then manipulated Timothy into confessing to the police regarding the murder of his wife. After this second confession, police began a search of 10 Rillington Place, and on the 2nd of December, they found the bodies of Beryl and Geraldine in the wash house in the back garden. Both victims had been strangled to death. After the discovery of the bodies, police questioning immediately intensified. Timothy was questioned for 3 more days, barely being allowed any sleep. Eventually, he was broken down and confessed to strangling Beryl in an argument about money and then killing baby Geraldine about 2 days later. There was no physical evidence to tie Evans to the crime, only his conflicting police statements. Throughout the years, experts would point out that the many inconsistencies of his confessions were possible indicators of coercion. Timothy went on to withdraw all of his confessions, however, the damage was already done. Timothy would be taken to trial on the 11th of January 1950. When asked why he would confess to a murder that he didn't commit, Timothy said that he feared the police officers would hurt him if he didn't tell them what they wanted. John and Ethel were the star witnesses against Evans. Both testified that they would often hear the couple having loud arguments upstairs, and John swore that he had never offered to perform an abortion. Unfortunately, the jury would be swayed by Christie's reputation as a war veteran and his previous career serving as a police constable. The trial lasted 3 days, with the jury deliberating for only 40 minutes. Timothy Evans was found guilty of the murders of his wife and daughter and was sentenced to be hung from the neck until dead. Timothy then appealed his conviction, though no errors were found, and on the 9th of March 1950, he was led to the gallows at Pentonville Prison. A few days after the trial had ended, Christie had found his pet dog playing with a human skull at the end of his garden. It turns out he had done such a poor job of burying the remains of his first 2 victims that bones had started to rise from the ground. It's pretty shocking to me that the police had missed this when they were searching the garden. Timothy removed the skull and threw it into the ruins of a house that was bombed during the Blitz of World War II. When it was eventually discovered, authorities assumed it belonged to an unknown victim of an air raid. Soon after Timothy's execution, John would find a new job working as a clerk for the British Road Service. He started on the 12th of June 1950, and this was the same day that some new neighbours would fill the now vacant top floor flat at 10 of Rillington Place. These neighbours were all of African descent, something that greatly annoyed John and Ethel, who were both very racist. Tensions began to flare up almost immediately and would only continue to devolve into outright hostility. Eventually, one of the housemates was accused of assaulting Ethel, and John used this incident to his advantage, suing for exclusive rights to use the back garden. John won the case in court, saying that he needed a private space for him and his wife where they could be away from the neighbours. It is almost certain that the real reason was to prevent them from finding the human remains that were buried there. The next year and a half would be rather uneventful. There were no more killings until the 6th of December 1952, when John suddenly, and apparently for no reason, quit his job. He found himself unable to find new work and quickly fell into financial hardship. Only a week later, On the morning of the 14th of December, he strangled his wife, Ethel, to death in their bed before lowering her body under his kitchen's floorboards. I find it hard to believe that he had killed Ethel in some desperate attempt to prevent her finding out about his unemployment. He had only quit his job a week earlier. There must have been some other motive behind the killing of the only significant partner that John had ever had in his life. However, if there was, he took that secret to his grave. Afterwards, in an attempt to cover up what he had done, John began writing to Ethel's family members, claiming that she had rheumatism and was unable to write for herself. When neighbours began to ask of Ethel's whereabouts, he would tell them that she was in Sheffield, away visiting family. After killing his wife, John immediately began to liquidate her assets. He sold her wedding ring and watch, and then most of the furniture in their home. He decided only to keep the cutlery, a dining table, 2 chairs, and a mattress. A week later, John forged his wife's signature and emptied out her bank account. Between the January and March of 1953, Christie would kill 3 more victims. The exact dates of these killings are unknown. First was Kathleen Mahoney, a sex worker who John had met at a nearby cafe before luring her back to his home. Then came the Irish immigrant named Rita Wilson, who was pregnant and looking for an abortion. Christie had convinced her to inhale his special mixture before strangling her to death. Finally was Hectorina McLennan. She was looking for a property to rent with her boyfriend in London, and the couple had befriended Christie after meeting at a local cafe. John promised that he would consider subletting his property to them, leading to the trio meeting up occasionally over the next few weeks. The couple would grow to trust John, and eventually he invited Hectorina to come back and view the property alone. She would never be seen alive again. All 3 of these victims were essayed and then strangled. After they were dead, John stored their bodies behind an alcove in the kitchen wall, which he then covered with wallpaper. Over the next few weeks, many of John's neighbours began to notice the distinct smell of disinfectant emanating from 10 Rillington Place. During March, Christie would attempt to strike again. This time he lured another woman to his flat under the guise of a sublet. However, this did not go according to plan. The woman turned up with her boyfriend and enough money to pay for 3 months' rent up front. Christie, feeling unable to turn down the offer, accepted the money and promised to vacate the property by the following morning. Unfortunately for the couple, they would have to leave after just 1 night. Christie's landlord found them living in the property and informed them that he had no right to rent it out to them and that they had been scammed. Upon learning that his downstairs flat had been left vacant, the landlord then gave permission to one of his other tenants, Beresford Brown, to use Christie's kitchen. At first, Brown didn't notice anything strange in the kitchen. However, after 4 days without disinfection, a foul odour began to escape from the hidden alcove. On the 24th of March, Brown peeled back the wallpaper, only to discover the 3 dead women's bodies. In utter disbelief, he then asked another tenant to come and confirm what he had discovered, finding it hard to accept as reality. After the other tenant confirmed the grisly discovery, Brown ran for a phone and called the police. A citywide search for Christie immediately ensued. After abruptly abandoning his property and the graveyard that was hidden within, John Christie had booked a room in a hostel for 7 nights in the King's Cross area of London. He had used both his real name and address when signing in, though only stayed for 4 of the 7 nights, taking flight after hearing of the discovery of the bodies. Now, you may expect that Christie would have fled London after this. Maybe that he would have attempted to settle down under a false identity somewhere else in the country, but you'd be wrong. Instead, he aimlessly wandered around London and slept on the streets. He ended up selling his watch for money, and after only 1 week was apprehended near Putney Bridge after refusing to share his identity with a police officer. The only thing that was in his pocket at the time of the arrest was a newspaper clipping about the execution of Timothy Evans. Over the course of his interrogations, Christie would admit to all killings except for one. He refused to take responsibility for the death of Geraldine Evans, Timothy's daughter. However, there are unconfirmed reports that he eventually did confess to this murder at a later date to an unknown nurse in a prison hospital. Christie's trial began on the 22nd of June 1953 in the same courtroom where Timothy Evans had been convicted of murder just 3 years earlier. He was only put on trial for one of the murders, that of his wife Ethel. He tried to plead not guilty by reason of insanity. Dr. Matheson, one of the prison doctors who had examined Christie pre-trial, explained that the man had a quote, hysterical personality, but was still legally sane. The jury wholeheartedly rejected Christie's insanity plea, and after only 85 minutes of deliberation, found him guilty of first-degree murder. Mr. Justice Finnemore sentenced him to death. John Christie was hanged at exactly 9 a.m. on the 15th of July 1953 at Pentonville Prison. The man who carried out his execution, Albert Pierrepoint, was the same man who had hung Evans for a crime he did not commit. Christie's body was then buried in an unmarked grave on prison grounds. Alright guys, thank you for watching. Did you know that over 98% of my viewers are unsubscribed? So I'm not going to ask if you enjoyed this video, but if you found it interesting or learned anything new, then please remember to leave a like and subscription so you won't miss any of my future work. What do you think about this story? I'd really like to start a discussion in the comments section below. I read every comment and I try to reply to as many as possible. Finally, if you want to hear about another police officer serial killer from London who lived with the bodies of his victims, why not check out my video covering Dennis Nelson, the kindly killer. It is insane to me that this has happened more than once. Other than that, thank you for watching, and I'll see you all next time.